Hello, welcome back to our continued discussion about the Holocaust, and today the focus is going to be on Judaism and on the history of anti-Semitism. So we'll take a little bit of time to consider this particular faith and the people who practice it, and that's probably the first thing that I'd want to stress to you. I mentioned the different ways that you could do a course like the Holocaust and what you could stress, and one would be the victim's perspective or those who were targeted. And the book that I'm using this term, and you have, and this is something that's important, The World Must Know. One of the things I really like about this, it's a guide to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. So if you were to read through this, you would actually pretty much know what is in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and the way in which they walk you through the story, if you will, about the Holocaust. But the first thing that they do in this book, and it took me a long time to realize the importance of this, is they show pictures of people. And these are people who were targeted and murdered during this time period, 1933 to 1945. So you see these images in sepia tones of mothers, grandmothers, children, entire families, more formal pictures. And the reason that I'm showing these to you is to stress that what you're going to encounter in this course, the Nazi perspective and the stereotypes, are wrong. The first thing that you should consider with this kind of event is that this happened to people. People, perhaps in some ways, not all that different from you. They had beliefs, they had arguments, they had confusion in their lives, bad things happened to them, great things happened to them. They struggled to understand what it was all about, and they did the best they could. And so, to start, I think that's a healthy way to think about this first, and then we're going to get to the stereotypes and the ways in which these people were seen in mass oversimplification, which allowed for a certain kind of belief system to emerge. Okay, so let's start now with Judaism itself. Judaism is a monotheistic religion. It is not the first monotheistic religion, but it was a crucial, important step in the development of monotheistic faiths. And one of the things that you see with the Holocaust is it's different from those polytheistic faiths. Like, for example, you've got Greek and Roman paganism, and those faiths emphasized kind of blends of the human and those of God. So pagan gods, could drink. In fact, there was a god, Dionysus, the god of wine. Pagan gods also existed in particular places. So you might travel from one place to another in the land that we now call Israel, Palestine in the past, and there would be different gods that would be seen as in charge of things, as the ones that are to be believed. So monotheism is a revolutionary change. It's the idea that there is one unifying God, not gods plural. And this idea too with Jews that God is not like humans. God is a totally different entity. So God does not eat, drink, it doesn't beget, doesn't have sex, and God wasn't born. And if you go to temple and you will walk in, you will not see any kind of religious images of God as people, as a person, like you would, for example, in a Catholic church where you would see Jesus on a cross. Okay. There's some important dates that are in The World Must Know for Jews and Judaism. One of the big ones, 586 BCE, and I'd like you to know that BCE means before Common Era. Okay, Jewish people use before Common Era and Common Era to denote what Christians would see as BC and AD. Okay, so different set of terms. Anyway, the first destruction, I should say the destruction of the first temple by Babylonians occurred in 586. Jews were then expelled from Israel, kicked out. Then in 70 CE, you see the destruction of the second temple by Romans. And if you were to go to Jerusalem today, you would see that wall that is the only wall remaining standing, which is the wall that Jews go to pray. Sometimes it's called the Wailing Wall, and sometimes people, Orthodox Jews and other Jews, will write prayers on small pieces of paper and insert it into the cracks of that wall. So the Jews were expelled again. And this is a very, very important point, because what happened was Jews were then faced with a choice. And this choice is discussed on page 6 of this edition of The World Must Know. And I'm going to read this to you to show what it meant. There were two kinds of responses to the defeat of 70 CE. And the first, the Zealots, this group of people, a group of Jews, fought a full-scale military battle against Rome. When I was able to travel to Israel, I was able to go to Masada, this hill, this mount, where the Jews, the Zealots, held out against the Romans. And the Romans eventually built, it was amazing, but they used slaves, and they built this ramp out of dirt, and eventually got up there and wanted to kill all of the Jews there. So what they found later in archaeological digs were shards of pottery that had numbers on it that they believe were used in a kind of a lottery system for those zealots when they committed suicide. They would rather kill themselves than be captured by the Romans. The other, it says, the other form of response to the defeat of 70 CE was, they call it political accommodation. And that's to preserve the spiritual integrity of Judaism. So what I think of here is this is a move toward accommodation and kind of assimilating or blending or laying low within dominant cultures, rather than being militant about identity. And that was the way that Jews sought to preserve their culture. So after these diasporas, after these terrible events, these destructions of the temples, Jews could no longer afford to put all their faith in a particular place as the place where spirituality was to be enacted. The Torah became the moving form of Judaism and the way to express religious faith through this set of scrolls. And that created the diaspora, which is the migration of the Jewish population all over the globe. There are Jews on probably every continent, maybe except Antarctica. The idea that these people wouldn't be concentrated necessarily in one place, but their faith could make them mobile, and thus they could survive. Some history. In the 4th century CE, Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. So before then, like I said, paganism ruled. There was a period of confusion and trying to sort things out. And ultimately, Romans decided that they were going to embrace Christianity. What happened then were two forms of Jewish ancestry developed in different regions in Europe. One is called the Ashkenazi, and these are Jews who hail primarily from Northern and Eastern Europe, so places like Poland, Germany, Czech Republic. And you can note that over 90% of Jews in the early 20th century are Ashkenazic in origin. The second form of Jewish ancestry is the Sephardic Jew, and those are descendants of Spain, Iberia, North Africa, and the Middle East, a much smaller percentage, and sometimes having their own language and customs and beliefs, like one language, Spanish version of Hebrew is Ladino, and also to a group which were persecuted in Spain during the Inquisition, came to be called the Conversos. So these were people who converted to the dominant faith, but they kept practicing Judaism maybe in secret. So many different aspects to identity. Now I want to chat with you about the denominations of Judaism and some early ways that anti-Semitism was promoted, and this idea of a negative approach to an understanding of Jewish people and a discriminatory practice against Jews. So let's begin with these denominations. And there are four that I want to just briefly touch on so you'll understand a little bit better some aspects of the Holocaust. Eventually we'll get to. Denomination of Judaism, the first one we'll discuss here. Orthodox Jews are the most fundamentalist, if you will, and they're traditional. So they follow the oral Torah, which is passed down orally, and then there's the written Torah, which is the biblical Torah. And this is something that is taken literally, and observance is seen as traditional and unchangeable over time. So again, this is kind of a fundamentalist branch of the faith. If you were to, say for example, go to Gibbon, there are some Orthodox Jews there who work at a meat processing plant, a kosher meat packing plant, and you will see that they're dressed in a very different kind of unique way, usually wearing white button-down type shirts and black pants. They may have the earlocks and full beards. So different kinds of ways of being that are set. Okay. There's also other branches. Reform Judaism. This developed in response to the Enlightenment, and the idea here was that the oral and written Torah are reflecting people's search and connection with God, and they're not intended to be interpreted literally as the Orthodox would interpret. Conservative Jews, this is the idea of a response to Reform Judaism, and we ought to, or at least I should say these Jews ought to consider the oral and written Torah, and they should be conserved. We should only modernize what is needed for observance in the modern world. Okay, so it's like a middle ground, if you will, between Orthodox and Reform. And then the final denomination, Reconstructionist Judaism, is the smallest group and the most experimental, modern, very new. So what observance is experimental, freely interpreted to be meaningful. So again, emphasizing that point that there are many different ways of being religious in the world, and that there is no one form of Judaism. Now, I want to next go into some of the stereotypes and histories that relate to the oppression of Jewish people. One defining characteristic for Jews has been an historical exclusion from dominant groups. As I just mentioned, the diaspora before, Jews started a process of accommodation to the dominant culture. They didn't make waves, they didn't want to dominate, they didn't much proselytize to other groups trying to get members. So some of the things that Jews have been thought of as having as negative qualities, renegades from Christianity and the ones who are seen as Christ killers, those who crucified Christ. I want to investigate this because, as I have here, there are a lot of contradictions and misinformation involved in these beliefs. Okay, your text, The World Must Know, emphasizes a few important points, and it talks about here Christianity was born in Jewish destruction. It's from this part of the page here. I don't know if you can see that, but that's on page 6 of the text. It says that Jesus of Nazareth was a practicing Jew, and in fact, the Last Supper was a Seder. So Judaism was the source of Christianity. You wouldn't have it without Jews. The Romans were the ones who crucified Jesus, not the Jews. The Romans were in charge of the political process and life in the Roman Empire. So they made those decisions, even though the there have been some discussions about how the church for many years emphasized culpability of Jews. And what's happened in the last few years, this is something from 2009, the bishops have apologized for promoting the idea that Jews killed Jesus, and that this is something that we should stop doing, or Christians should stop saying. Jews don't accept Jesus as their savior, so Jews are apostate. They are not accepting of this figure as the Messiah. The relationship between Christianity and Judaism, Christian beliefs are based on Judaism's 10 Commandments, which were handed down to Moses on Mount Sinai. And the other commandments that many Jews practice, hundreds of different kinds of rules, which we'll talk about in the practicing of Judaism. Then what happened, during the 4th century is that church law became civil law because the Roman Empire, the conversion of key figures in Roman political life to Christianity, led to it becoming the Holy Roman Empire. And that was the beginning of, you could say, kind of some anti-Semitic ideas rooted in theology. And from there, modern anti-Semitism made a leap from this religious root to other things like we'll discuss, a racial anti-Semitism and the idea of excluding Jews from economic life and social status. I once took a seminar on Judaism and the Jewish faith from a fellow Roger Brooks, who at the time taught in Connecticut at a university. And he emphasized something that I've never forgotten, and I try to emphasize to others. He said that a key idea with Judaism is the notion that separateness is holy. There's a lot in those last 3 words, separateness is holy. In order to be a practicing Jew, what you have to do is to follow certain rules, certain laws that were handed down, as I said before, from God. And that practice is in some ways what really defines Judaism more than faith. Do you follow the law? And that means that for Orthodox Jews, they have many, many specific rituals and behaviors they need to accomplish and ways of being in the world on a daily basis. So practices of everyday life. So you've got a lot of different rules, including things related to clothing. I mentioned the types of clothes that Orthodox Jews wear. And diet, we'll talk about kosher diet in a minute. The separation of foods. You wouldn't want to mix milk and meat because you wouldn't want to mix a cow and a kid in terms of the types of foods you would be consuming together. So Jews, Orthodox Jews, do not eat cheeseburgers. The way food is prepared. The observance of the Sabbath, which is Saturday. Other holidays, high holy holidays, and smaller, more minor holidays may be followed by Orthodox Jews in a much stricter manner than some of the others like Reform or Conservative Jews or Reconstructionists. So the idea of performing religious rituals and learning prayers, all of these things are part and parcel what counts as Judaism. And in order to fill this in a little more, I'm going to go forward to the next slide. So now let me present to you a piece from a website. And it's a website you can see up here, Judaism 101. If you're interested in Judaism, you can go to this site. And let me tell you, you can spend an entire semester studying Judaism. In fact, let me rephrase that. You can spend a lifetime studying Judaism. But this website gives you a very basic taste and introduction to the complexities of this religion, a very complex, intricate form of faith and practice. Okay, so the thing I want to just show you briefly, and you can zoom in on this if you like, is the notion of what's called kashrut, which are Jewish dietary laws, the idea of what is kosher. Okay, so the ideas presented in this little article, and it's actually not that little, it's many pages, will tell you about, what foods can and cannot be eaten. It says here biblical dietary restrictions, the foods that cannot be eaten, how foods are to be separated, and the forms of certification, which makes it easier to identify what counts as kosher food. So it says, oops, sorry about that line. Dietary laws, especially for Orthodox Jews, are to be observed all year long. And Orthodox Jews will have in their homes 2 separate dishwashers, one for certain types of food prepared in certain ways and another for other types. Kosher is not a style of cooking, it mentions down here. Chinese food can be kosher if it's prepared in accordance with the rules that dictate what counts as kosher. There are certain kinds of rituals for the slaughtering of animals. There are certain kinds of animals that cannot be eaten. For example, you wouldn't eat a camel. You wouldn't eat pork as a Jew. And some people argue that these were based on health concerns. Like, for example, pigs used to have trichinosis as a regular sort of occurrence, and so maybe it made sense for health reasons that Jews did not eat that meat. It's debatable. Others would say, well, Jewish people don't eat bottom feeders. They don't eat shellfish, and that's perhaps because, in part, they eat anything. Crabs will eat anything, and so maybe that idea of that's not necessarily healthy food to be eating. Anyway, the point is that there are many, many ways of being in the world, and Jews have particular kinds of codes that say these are the right ways of being. These are the ways you should follow. They're the laws. And this is just one piece, the dietary restrictions. When I was in Israel, for example, one of the laws is for Orthodox Jews is you do not set a spark during the Sabbath. You do not light a fire. So what that meant in practical terms was that you couldn't use electrical appliances because that's setting a spark. So what they had in Jerusalem, and I thought this was fascinating, was they had the kosher elevator. And the way that worked was the elevator would go from floor to floor, and it would stay on a floor for a minute or two, so people had the chance to go in or out. In practical terms, though, no Jew had to set a fire or set a spark by pushing a button. So it would appear, people would get on the elevator, and then it would close, the doors would close eventually, and it would take them up to the next floor, and the doors would open. So that allowed those followers, the Orthodox followers, to not be out of line with the laws that came down from Mount Sinai. So many different ways of being in the world, and this is one that I think is fascinating and worthy of study, and has many, many aspects that are things you could investigate on your own. So now back to our discussion about Judaism and these rules and ideas. You have a basic understanding now, a very, very simplified understanding of how Judaism plays out in everyday life. Okay. Now I want to talk briefly about sources of prejudice and anti-Semitism. In medieval Europe, so this period of Europe between, you could say, 400 CE to, you could say, 1200, some people would say up to maybe 1600 CE, you could argue that Jews faced forms of prejudice, all right, barred from certain kinds of professions, for example, barred from skilled trades. And what happened is because of those bars, Jews had to develop other forms of livelihood. So, for example, traders, being involved in trade, because different Jews in different parts of Europe would be able to share a language and have a network of suppliers and sellers, so that facilitated trade. Jews were also tanners. Jews were doctors, and also one of the stereotypes sometimes people say are Jews control the world, they control the world financial reserves. The idea of Jewish people as moneylenders. You might recall that Jesus threw the money lenders out of the temple. So that kind of restriction on being able to lend money is not within the Jewish faith. Jews can lend money. So they became specialists, if you will, in that practice. But what happened then was these kinds of things became the roots of stereotypes. And stereotypes are sort of fixed understandings of the world in kind of an oversimplified way. And stereotypes are worth talking about for a second. Everyone stereotypes. It's a human practice. People need to make sense of the world in real time, and they try desperately to take complex situations and simplify them so that they can go on with their lives. The problem with stereotyping is that in the past it was very useful in terms of evolution. You want to know clearly, oh, I can eat this thing, but this thing might eat me, right? You have to size up situations quickly. Today our world is much more complex and nuanced, so stereotypes can lead to unfortunate categorizations of people that really are not complex and not real, and that leads to discrimination and rather unsavory things. So stereotypes would emerge about Jews. And also, too, I want to emphasize that, as it says up here, separateness is holy. So Jews created separate communities in order to facilitate their practices. It's much easier to follow codes of conduct if you have others around you supporting that practice. Okay, so if you have others around you who are eating kosher, who have the similar codes of dress and rituals and prayers, so those communities and practices evolved, and at the same time, even though they supported the people in them, they created certain social isolation, and so Jews began being seen as the other within predominantly Catholic and Christian communities and those around them. Jews then lived and were restricted in their movements, and they lived in places like ghettos. And the very first ghetto was in Italy, in Venice, Italy, and the term is related to the notion in Italian of foundry. So these were not desirable places to be, and Jews were often walled into areas, and they had to pay attention to curfews, follow the rules of the dominant groups around them, and they had to engage in specific practices. So, for example, sometimes had to wear special emblems, clothing, in order to be recognized as Jews and part of the community, but yet not different. Okay. By the time you get to the 1700s in Western Europe, you have the emergence of the Enlightenment. And I have some characteristics here. The Enlightenment promotes things like science, which is rooted in empiricism. So the concrete world instead of faith as the basis for truth, right? We use our senses, taste, touch, sight, smell, hearing, in order to understand the real concrete world as it exists. And that's the source of science. It's not based on faith, right? So the Enlightenment, this intellectual movement in Western Europe, promotes science. It promotes increasingly secularization, and that's a move away from religion as a source of truth. Before the Enlightenment, faith-based ways of understanding dominated people's thinking. All you have to do is travel in Europe to see these churches that were the centers of European medieval life. They had the best architecture, they had beautiful stained glass, they were the places where you would hear amazing music, choral displays of people singing, organs, the most fantastic instruments around. So Europe is starting to move away from religion as the source of truth, and it also, too, is a source of political power, right? Monarchs were put in charge because they were chosen, they had chosen by God, divine right. we see the emphasis on reason and individual freedom, okay, with the Enlightenment. And I'll continue on the next slide. So during this period of the Enlightenment, you have Jews are increasingly emancipated. And that's discussed on page 10 of The World Must Know. There's a section where I have the word emancipation underlined. What it means is that Jews were given equal right as citizens to the citizens of anyone in a particular land, like France or Germany. That means that the previous restrictions and the previous segregation in ghettos started to fall by the wayside. And as that happened, Jews, many Jews, Western European Jews, began assimilating. They began starting to integrate aspects of the dominant culture into their lives. So what you saw then were some of the movements that I talked about earlier in slides, the different denominations that were not as traditional or fundamentalist as Orthodox type faith. So contemporary Jews may wear a yarmulke or a kippah on Saturday during the Sabbath, but they may shave their face. They may not have the earlocks. They may not wear traditional clothing. They may not follow kosher dietary restrictions. Okay, and this assimilation is sort of like a kind of middle point, you could say, between the traditions of the past, the very strong fundamentalism, and moving more toward accommodating modern life. Now here's the one thing I'd like to emphasize. Okay, Western Jews were much more engaged in assimilation than were Eastern Jews. And making that point, there's a discussion, let's see if I can find it really quickly, about what are called Shtetls. Okay, this is on page 12 of The World Must Know. And I'm going to show you really briefly. It's right here. Shtetls were communities in Eastern Europe, and where Jews were more Orthodox. They would wear black kaftans, were piously observant. And so this difference between Western and Eastern European Jews in terms of assimilation is important to know for understanding the history we're going to discuss. Now, I want to touch on 4 different types of anti-Semitism, which are very important to know, and will set you up for readings that we'll look at, like, for example, brief sections of Hitler's Mein Kampf, and others which will inform variations on anti-Semitism and how it works, and it's got these different dimensions. Let's start with the root, theological anti-Semitism. It's often seen as the most basic form of anti-Semitism. And in this one, Jews are seen as the killers of Christ. If you consider that Jews provided God, Jews were also seen as providing God's murderer from this perspective. So Jewish people are apostate. What's considered the spiritual heroes of Judaism are, for themselves, the Christians, because the Christians aren't fighting the prophets. The Christians see Jews as very paradoxical and annoying in a sense, because the Hebrew Bible prophesizes things like prophets will come, but then anti-Semites would say the Jews don't understand their own prophecies, right? So this idea is the root. And what happens is this notion of Jews as Christ killers, which I think I talked about a little earlier. But the idea was that the Jews were given the vote by the Romans on what should be done, with Jesus. And the line that you might hear in some faiths, in some discussions was, he should be killed, and let the blood of Jesus fall on our heads and the heads of our our ancestors, or I'm sorry, of our descendants. So there's this notion that Jews were the ones killing Christ when in fact Romans did it. But this has been a very, very powerful myth that has been promoted over time because they're seen as killing a central figure of what came to be the dominant religion in Europe. And that meant that there were certain other myths that emerged. Blood libel was one myth, and this is the idea that Jews would murder Christian children in the Middle Ages and then use their blood for something like Passover breads. And this may have emerged in part because Passover breads would have maybe red spores on them. And Christian children, like all children, sometimes would die, sometimes would run away, sometimes would fall into wells, and they would disappear. And Christians might make sense of those disappearances or deaths as saying, oh, these people did that to our children. Again, this group of people who's the other, who's kind of removed from everyday life for Christians. So things like the blood libel myth emerges. Jews are believed to have distinct physical characteristics. They're thought to have things like split hooves, and that the men are thought of as menstruating. And one year somebody said, oh, could you be serious? I mean, this can't possibly be that they thought this. Well, indeed, if you go and look at articles, this is one from a journal which talks about the propagation of the myth of Jewish male menstruation in 17th century Spain. The Bulletin of History of Medicine. So if you're interested in these topics, there's a lot more that you can look at. People have spent their careers considering things like forms of anti-Semitism. The thing about these, even though they sound somewhat preposterous to us today, is the community of Jewish believers were, as I said, separate. And so the myths could be promoted, but they'd never get necessarily disconfirmed. Okay? If you're not seeing the people or interacting with them much, you don't have cause to say, well, this is clearly wrong. So Jews ended up being blamed for things like the Black Plague, the Black Death. Okay? And it's interesting because in a video that you'll see for the class, The Architecture of Doom, it shows images of Jews alongside of rats. Jews are seen as like a parasitic animal, and that association arguably could be linked all the way back to the Black Plague and the rats that would carry this plague all around Europe. Pogroms also were frequent during the Middle Ages in Europe, and a pogrom you could define as an attack against Jewish people and their property. These quite often happened in Eastern Europe. The surrounding communities would attack Jewish shtetls, and what's amazing to think about is that sometimes they would even be forewarned, or they would know, Jews would know in advance that this attack was coming. And so they might do something like collect money to pay off or bribe the people who were otherwise going to attack them and potentially kill them. So that's theological, pre-modern anti-Semitism. Next, romantic anti-Semitism. This, I'd like you to know, is rooted in Romanticism, and Romanticism is a response to the Enlightenment. Right? So the Enlightenment promotes reason and rationality, science and secularization. That's in the 1700s. The early 1800s, you see Romanticism start to develop. And that's the idea that humans are driven by other things besides reason and rationality, like passion and feelings. That on some level, people are emotional creatures, and that's what makes humans unique and distinct. And that's what Romantics thought should be emphasized about human beings and human life. To continue with the forms of anti-Semitism and the idea of romantic anti-Semitism, Romantics thought of nations as important concepts. A nation is a people, it says here, and nations are different, according to Romantics. Folk are different. So there's an essential German. French are very different from Germans. Italians are different from the French. These are people. And what's important is that people are supposed to be rooted, from this perspective, in blood and soil. They're connected to a particular land and a particular place in the world. So the worst thing you could be is Romantics thought of as a cosmopolitan. You don't have roots. You don't understand that you are essentially, in some ways, a German or French or Italian, and that is core to your humanness. All right. So nations are thought to have a soul or a spirit, right? And that's what promotes nationalism, patriotism, kind of an extreme form of patriotism. This means that there's a natural order to things, a social order. Life is organic. People who are connected through Germanic ties or Italian ties have a special tie with each other. And that these ties build different characteristics which are seen as natural. If you go against those things, Romantics would believe that that's bad or immoral. Right? And so what you do is you get a sense of binaries, ways of thinking about the world that are pejorative, or in some of them are clearly pejorative. Here's some examples. Romantics would say that the city is bad, the country is good, because the country is organic. Again, it's the soil that people are farming, right? The city is artificial. City man is artificial. The peasant is who is considered real and authentic, okay? Again, connected with land. Capitalism is seen as an artificial system, a system of taking advantage of other people. Socialism is seen as real and worthy of respect. Inorganic things are bad. Organic things are good. Again, emerging naturally. That's seen as positive. Cosmopolitans, as I mentioned earlier, are bad. You know, if you're not connected to any particular place, you are inauthentic. The local, the regional, the grounded in a particular root of soil, that's seen as good. So therefore, foreigners, outsiders are bad, and the folk, like the German folk, are good. So what then happens is you get a whole big setup here, which can be related to Judaism. And what side Jews would fall on this equation? Well, for Hitler, Jews were associated with urban life. These were city people. They promoted capitalism because, of course, they're engaged in money lending. They're seen as false, aberrations of nature. They're the ultimate cosmopolitans because of the diaspora. They've been spread all over the world, and they're never from a place, so they're foreigners, right? So you have this perfect equation that makes Jews out to be people not to be trusted, people who are outside of these binaries as negative forms of the binary. So the bottom line, the summary of all this, Jews in the traditional anti-Semitism were thought of as committing deicide, the murder of God. In Romantics ideas, Jews are now accused of folkicide, the murder of a people. Okay, so that's a very important thing to note, this particular bullet point. Please remember that, focus on that. The third form of anti-Semitism I want to consider with you, political anti-Semitism, starts to emerge in the 19th century, and you see this notion of, kind of like the Romantics, a national identification, where people begin to say, I am German, I am French, I am Italian, because the old empires are starting to break up. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire that existed before is now splintering into these different nations, and they want political autonomy. You have the Roman Empire that disbanded, the Spanish Empire, and the British Empire. The colonies are starting to want their independence, and they're starting to claim their national identity. All right, so the empires are breaking up, and here nationalists who are anti-Semitic, anti-Semites, they don't see Jews as belonging to their nation. They see Jews as something like a different nation, right? So Jews can't be German. Jews can't be French if you're a political anti-Semite. And the reason is because they're a nation unto themselves. Jews are thought of by political anti-Semites as a nation unto themselves. They're considered first and foremost, to be committed to and loyal to a faith, a religious faith. So the idea is they're a nation, they're a people, and if they're a people who are committed, loyal to their own people, they can't be part of our people, our German people, our French people, as examples. So this is a very important point. Jews are seen as a state within a state. They don't belong from the political anti-Semitic perspective. And there's also this notion promoted by political anti-Semites that Jews want to take over. They don't want to participate in political life or the life of a nation. They want to dominate. They want to rule. So this notion that they're disproportionately influential, literate, because of course the Bible, the Torah, this notion of the Hebrew Bible, is Jews are the people of the book. A written tradition passed down from one generation to another, that promotes literacy. And that's why, again, you see some of the stereotypes emerging about Jews. So the final slide of this section, the fourth type of anti-Semitism I'd like you to know is racial anti-Semitism. Now, the idea here begins with social Darwinism as a precursor, and the notion is that society is just like nature. You can't intervene. The guy who promoted the idea of survival of the fittest is actually a sociologist. His name is Herbert Spencer, and Spencer believed that you shouldn't aid poor people. Welfare was stuff that held a society, a social order back. So this is a categorical mistake in a way, because people are not like other species. We can intervene, and it's not going to be just like nature. We're not driven by instinct alone. Others can help people who may not necessarily be what some would say best suited to survival. And a great example of this would be someone like Stephen Hawking, right? If you really believed in social Darwinism, Stephen Hawking would have died long, long, long before he developed amazing theories about the universe and time. So social Darwinism is an important precursor to anti-Semitism. Now, what I want to emphasize here also is that in this form, the nature of existence is believed to be defined by race. All right, what does that mean? There's a fellow, Joseph Corbineau, okay, Joseph Arthur Corbineau, and he wrote this book, The Inequality of the Human Races. So the argument he presented, races are separate and independent. Race is crucial for understanding the process of human history. And what's really crucial is to think of pure races, because those, according to Corbineau, are vital. They are filled with life. They're rich. They're not misogyninated, right? They're not watered down. And they're conquerors. So the Greeks, the Romans, and Jews, pure races, conquerors. The Aryans, also seen as conquerors. If they're a pure race, then they have power and strength. As I said a second ago, misogyninated races, mixed races, they lose their power and purity. They're to be avoided. So Jews are seen as vital because they've had a long separation, as I discussed earlier. But what they're seen as is they're seen as the root of metaphysical darkness. They're evil. So they're pure, but they're pure evil. Okay? Aryans, on the other hand, are light-skinned, good, blonde. They represent the good in this equation of good versus evil that seems to be the emerging history of race that people are starting to focus on. Because the argument here is that race is crucial in human history, and there's a huge battle or war coming between the races. One is going to emerge as dominant because people who are racial anti-Semites believe that all history is about race and that one race must emerge as dominant. Jews, according to this perspective, should not be the race that emerges because they're unhealthy, diseased, parasitic. And they're seen as like a cancer on society. So the notion is that If you have a tumor can't be brought into the fold. A tumor can't be made healthy. A tumor is to be cut out, removed, killed. And therefore, Jews are not rehabilitatable. They are the essence of evil and problems. So they're like a cancer on society, like vermin. And again, you'll see that association between Jews and rats in various propaganda from the Nazis. And the idea is, again, you can't rehabilitate these people. A race must be destroyed if this hierarchy is to eventually result in the best race dominating. Now here's the last thing I want to mention. Okay, I talked about 4 types of anti-Semitism. Okay, theological, romantic, political, racial. What happened was Nazis fused portions of these into many different ways of propaganda, and they also took modernism, the idea of science, and combined it with some of these romantic notions we talked about, and belief in racial laws, and saw those racial laws as being like the law of gravity. You can't break the law of gravity, right? That's nature. And so these are seen as truths, right? They shouldn't be avoided, that it would be unnatural and immoral. The early movement called the Eugenics Movement was beginning in the United States in the early 1900s. And this was a big draw, which we'll see eventually, for Nazis, and greatly influenced Hitler, because the idea is that eugenics means the fittest, well, let me try this again. The definition of eugenics is the science of good breeding or right breeding. And eugenicists want to find out what the best qualities are in order to promote those for the fittest people to survive.